is a meeting of the Act 47 Building Energy Code Study Committee. This is our fourth meeting of 6, and today is September 5th, 2023. It's 9:30 a.m., just a bit after. Sorry, we had a little bit of a delayed start with some technical hiccups. I think we've got that all sorted out. If anyone can or cannot hear is having any kind of problem out in the field side, please raise your hand and we'll try to get that sorted out. With that, I'd like to jump right to our first bit of business. As always, we go over and review and approve or edit the minutes from our last meeting. So one thanks to Richard Facey for helping get minutes out to all of us. For those, I'm looking at the minutes from the August 22nd meeting, and I'm wondering if folks have any edits or corrections, additions to those. Okay. See, I'm seeing no hands there or in the room. With that, I welcome a motion to approve the minutes.
So moved.
Thank you, Matt. All those in favor, please raise your hand and say aye.
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 Okay, anyone opposed? Okay, no nays.
Do we need a second?
I don't think so.
Okay, that's it.
We've gotten motion to vote. Okay, so minutes are approved for August 22nd, 2023. Thanks so much to everyone. Again, I encourage people to take a look through them because there's a lot of discussion. This, in committee, we don't keep minutes, and sometimes I've been in other work groups where the minutes are so terse. It's useful as an outline of what you did. But in this case, we have a lot of content. So I'd encourage people to look back through them. They really are very helpful. With the minutes taken care of, I'd like to move on to our third item. Let me also, just to make it easier for folks who are taking care of minutes, do a quick roll call. Sometimes easier than chasing things down. Scott Campbell.
Here.
Mike DeRocher.
Here.
Matt Musgrave.
Yep.
Craig Peltier.
Here.
Jim Bradley.
Here.
Thank you. Jason Webster.
Here.
Thank you. Kelly, you're here. Tim Heron.
Here.
Thank you. Matt Sharp, I see you. Bob Duncan, I see you. Chris Burns.
Here.
Thank you. Sandy. Ted Brady, good morning. Richard's here. Barry here.
Yeah, there's.
Okay. Ben Ciboletti.
I am here.
Thank you. And I see Ellen right there. Okay. Anyone I didn't call out? Chris.
Anybody?
Sorry about that.
Right.
And anybody else? Okay, great. It's very helpful for folks taking the minutes that will want a check-in like that.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, great. Sandy.
Senator, before we start,
Sure.
I had a small thing I wanted to suggest to add to the agenda, but I don't even know if it needs discussion. I tried to develop a tool to help myself understand all of the pitches that were made.
Sure.
And so I sent it before the meeting to everybody, your whole CC list. And I troubled, I couldn't get to the copy because Capital Copies is closed for flooding.
Sure.
So I asked Kelly if she could copy it. She may have chance to do it this morning, but just so you know, it's I just submitted it in case it's useful for people.
Okay. Thanks for that. And
We had a printer jam, so
Oh.
I'm working on it.
Sorry, that's my challenge to her.
Technology today is not cooperating, sorry.
so thanks for that. And actually, the next thing relates to agenda for today. I just wanted to check in before we get going with today's agenda, see if there's anything that people would propose to add to our discussion. The other thing too is emails to the entire list. So we've talked about open meeting law and quorum. So if you email to any more than 10 people on anything other than anything substantive, not just a matter of schedule, then it's really getting like a policy and work discussion. And then we're in violation of open meeting law. So in order to doing two things to try to address that, please, if either when you want to email, when you want to communicate with other people in the group, if it's less than a quorum, less 10 or less, then you're good to go. If it's more than that and you want to reach out to the group, if you could send it to the chair and to Richard and to Kelly. That way we can take care of distribution in a way that keeps us in sync with open meeting law. So I in no way want to discourage people from chipping in and participating, but we do have to be careful about following the road for that piece. The other thing too is anything that inadvertently gone out to the group in a way in violation, I suppose, of a literal interpretation of open meeting law, we are posting to the web page that our working website so that they become we stay transparent and the public can see all the documents that we're all looking at to make. But we'd rather avoid that workaround by having stuff come again to Richard, Kelly, and myself and deal with distribution after. Okay, so thanks for the housekeeping. With that, I'd like to jump right in. We continue to have a lot of information to take in. And with that, I'd like to just turn it over to Richard and see if there's, or Kelly, if there's anything before we go on to real estate and energy codes. And first thing on the item is title insurance and energy codes with Michelle Farnham and Liz Smith. So anything before we turn? So good morning, Liz. I don't know if Michelle's also, you're doing this together or you're covering the topic entirely on your own.
Thank you, Senator Bray, and thanks to the committee members. I'm just here representing CADIC on behalf of myself. So Michelle's not going to be joining me, but thank you. Yeah, so I sent just a memorandum basically to the email list reflecting sort of some general, I guess, high level concepts and thoughts on how title insurance kind of would play a role in this, or ultimately would really not play a role in all of this, and for the multiple reasons why title is, in my opinion, not a good fit for the resolution that the committee has been studying, and certainly understanding that resolution is needed, and obviously the committee is working diligently on trying to solve these issues. Just kind of high level, I guess, the idea of marketable title, when we think about that conceptually, I just thinking, that it's really more about priority of interest than it is about use of property. Ultimately, I put in the definition that's based on common law in Vermont of what marketable title is, and just basically it's free from the probable claim of another. So again, going to this idea of the way I explain it, I do a lot of education is, can someone come and knock on your door and take title away from you or assert an interest prior in right to your interest based on whatever vesting instrument was conveyed to you? So it just, even that kind of broad concept sort of lends itself to the idea that the concept of an energy code or, even other types of permitting or, regulation in the state really doesn't make its fit into the marketable title concept. These issues do arise at time of resale for properties. So it's not that it is not, transactionally, comes into play at times. And generally people use realtors, and there are standard realtor contracts, that do address, municipal or state regulatory issues that might arise, but they ultimately aren't a part of the title search typically. And the way that that sort of functions is that, ultimately a title examiner is limited to the public records, and public records in the concept of title is the municipal land records. So as people are researching, to be able to assert marketable title and certify marketable title, which then allows for them to issue a title insurance policy, which is a, humongous part of any real estate transaction, oftentimes because there's a lender involved, and then people elect to also purchase an owner's title insurance policy. But ultimately, the title examiner is limited to that public land records research. Sellers have to disclose certain things under Vermont law to buyers, and sometimes permitting sort of problems or non-compliance come as a result of that. But you're not going to go and do a title search and find multiple notices of violations for municipal, state, wetlands, stormwater. They're just not NOVs, as we call them, riddled in the land records. So the title examiner is not on notice to be able to make that determination that there is some type of a violation. So, and then putting that into the statutory, sort of world that already exists. I just kind of highlighted for the group that the legislature has, already, had discussions such as these, and multiple permitting and regulatory non-compliance, and ultimately the way that the statutes exist now relative to municipal permits, RBES certificates, this very type of non-compliance that's on the table, stormwater, municipal, wetlands, those are all non-compliance that has already been determined by the legislature that its intent is not to be a title defect. So again, not that non-compliance is not an issue that needs resolution, but ultimately, the other piece of this is that this idea that a title examiner is limited to records, to make this a title defect of any sort would almost also be this tremendous burden. How would a title examiner be able to discover this when, kind of this regulatory system that you've been discussing about how to keep records of all of these certificates, make them accessible to the public? A title examiner would be at a massive disadvantage, because how would they even be able to discover this non-compliance at this point without some type of, a system in place to categorize and regulate non-compliance as a starting point. And then additionally, the public land records as a place for compliance issues, for RBES certificates or non-compliance is, one thing to consider is that, the municipal clerks already, are in a burdensome place throughout Vermont, in terms of, the resources that small municipalities need to be able to do their jobs and their recording responsibilities. So again, it's just kind of highlights that it's, to me, not a good fit. And then, one step further, looking at where the burden will fall, which will be on buyers and sellers, and, the domino effect that happens, and maybe some of you have even experienced this when you're have bought or sold real property in Vermont, but when an issue arises, whether it be determined to be a marketable title defect, or just a contractual issue where you were expecting to purchase something and ultimately, something has gone astray throughout the transaction, you know, that domino effect of how many buyers and sellers sort of ad infinitum that can impact becomes, you know, can be significant. And so ultimately with a non-compliance issue arising, if it were even discoverable, you know, how to remedy that and the impacts that would have on just sort of multiple layers of transactions. And then again, the burden falling on sort of, you know, either innocent sellers or innocent buyers who may not have even been a part of whatever type of construction or renovation that required the RBES in the first place. So again, just maybe ill-placed. And when it comes to actual title insurance as well, so, you know, again, title insurance is a part of almost every single real estate transaction. And at Caddick, we have a significant presence in Vermont. So we do insure the majority of residential real estate transactions and many commercial transactions as well in the state of Vermont. And so, you know, a title insurance product in and of itself is designed to protect you against what is unknown. Those things that can be discovered ultimately make their way into the policy as exceptions or exclusions. So the sort of design of the product, and which includes, you know, the pricing of the product, is that it's really not it's not hazard insurance, and it's not intended to protect against these types of issues, especially related to non-use. So it's not as if, you know, insurance companies are going to come in as sort of the, you know, the hero in these transactions and say, well, we'll insure this anyway. The reality is that the product isn't designed to insure this type of use issues. When it does insure these types of use issues, it's because there's a notice of violation of record and it's been missed. You know, just generally speaking, that's when a title insurance company comes in, because again, it's designed to protect against things that you could discover in the land records. So if something gets missed or has been misindexed by a clerk or something to that effect, then title insurance can come in and sort of save the day. But without something of record that reflects that it's a violation, why it's a violation, how to cure the violation, you know, the idea of it being a title defect would almost be somewhat impossible based on my understanding of what sort of the system is in place right now. To be able to discover non-compliance would put transactions at a screeching halt. So, you know, that's sort of where, you know, as a real estate attorney, and then being in this role as an underwriter for many years, and then, you know, managing Vermont's, you know, insurance here for Caddick. Yeah, I think that this would be very burdensome on the wrong parties. So thank you for the opportunity to speak, and can pass it on to the Chris Delia or whomever is going next. Thank you.
Thanks. Kelly?
Hi, I have a quick question. It seemed like what you were talking about was having a title defect if not only the certificate wasn't done and posted, but also if the house or the building didn't comply. Is that correct? And is there a difference if you just said that the title defect was only if the piece of paper wasn't there?
So so currently the legislation reflects that the absence of a certificate would not create a title defect. But ultimately, just pulling up the statute as it's written now. Failure to issue.
If you change that and said not having the certificate would create a title defect, but not going as far as what I think you were talking about of saying the building has to be proven to have met the requirements. Does that make sense?
Well, isn't the certificate what states that it's in compliance?
Yes. Yes, but I'm
So
saying if they just, go ahead.
Yeah, so I mean, the absence of the certificate, I guess, to me would be synonymous with saying the absence of being able to certify compliance. So it would be both you know, as it is written, would not be a title defect. So in my position would be that the statute isn't changed whatsoever. My inclusion of the statute was to highlight that the legislation has already taken this up, and in addition has looked at this concept in multiple other settings as well that have sort of a similar flavor, such as municipal permits or other type of state regulatory compliance issues, and again has you know, passed legislation that reflects that it is not in fact a title defect.
Right, I don't know how to be more clear about my question. I'm asking that when you talked about the potential downfalls of having a title defect due to, it sounded to me it wasn't just about this another certificate not being filed, but it was whether you could prove that the building had actually met the requirements, the standards. And I'm asking, could you have a title defect just because the piece of paper, the certificate wasn't there, not necessarily proof that the building met the standards? And what I run into, we get panic calls here from sellers trying to sell their home and that they don't have the certificate, and someone buying the home's lawyer wants it, and it's 10 years down the road and the builder, whatever, isn't there, is gone, out of business, whatever. And so it seems like having that title defect from the get-go of at least the certificate would remedy that situation where 10 years down the road, that certificate never got filed and there's no way to get it now.
Yeah, I guess I'm unclear on how it being a title defect would remedy the problem unless you had a statute of limitations on the ability to look back.
You want to say something?
No, I'm good, thank you.
I don't know if it's relevant or not, just my experience in selling real estate was there is a distinction between title insurance and what the attorney actually does. So she mentioned earlier in her testimony that title insurance insures the transfer of ownership so that you understand who does that. But at the other same time, while they're going in and digging title and looking at deeds, attorneys will oftentimes look at other things like permits and these types of cards. That wouldn't be part of your title insurance. That's part of your attorney looking to ensure prior that they've done their diligence, that they're transferring a property without additional harm being caused besides just the title. Is that correct, Liz?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, so an attorney's responsibilities, you know, extend beyond their role in being able to offer a title insurance policy, but also contractually in terms of what they are, you know, obligated to be able to provide to their client in terms of not just the insurability, and not just the marketability, but the ability to resell. So, you know, if I am missing a building code permit in Burlington for the new steps that I built, that's going to come up. If you called me and said there's no permit for the building steps, as a title insurance company, that's not going to be of great concern to me, because ultimately it's not going to be a covered matter under the product itself unless there is a notice of violation of record. And so the idea of RBES, you know, if there was an NOV of record, then there's potential coverage where we would want to see that to be resolved. Generally, there are some municipalities who issue NOVs, many don't, and I can think of one time that I've seen like a wetland permit notice of violation or an ANR notice of violation. Typically, you find non-compliance because a seller has told the buyer that they didn't do something correctly relative to the property, or questions begin to get asked as a part of the real estate transaction because there's a seller property information report that's provided. It's called a SPUR for real estate transactions.
Liz, can you say what kinds of things are the do create a title defect that would be recorded by a clerk? Are they, you're saying it's on land records. So does this mean literally like plot plans, or what is eligible for getting flagged in a title search? Like, what are they looking at?
So, I mean, a title search is under Vermont law to certify marketable title under the Marketable Record Title Act is a 40-year title search, limited to the public records. And an example would be, you know, you purchased property from Liz Smith. And, you know, during my period of ownership, I granted an option to purchase or a right of first refusal, as it's commonly termed, to, you know, my neighbor, Joe Brown. And I sold the property to you, Senator Bray. And now Joe Brown comes knocking on your door and says, I actually had an option to purchase this property under the same terms of the purchase and sale contract that you entered into. And I'm now going to assert my right that's first in time prior to yours. So the land records and priority is all about time, in terms of whose right gets recorded first, basically. And then that, I mean, that could be we could have an hour conversation on priority and time and notice and all kinds of different things in terms of that. But that would be an example. Another example would be, I sold you the property. I had a federal lien filed against me, and your title searcher who represented you as the buyer did not pay it at the closing. And then you own the property and the federal government comes knocking on the door and says, I was going to actually foreclose Liz Smith and her interest so that I could make my $120,000 back because she defrauded the government. And then their claim is against you instead of me.
I can see how any kind of complication in the closing is unwelcome news by all parties. But would it be in some way inappropriate if certificates were recorded as a public record with a town clerk so that they were accessible, were visible to the searcher as well as any other member of the public? Is that, I'm just wondering if it's something undesirable because it creates a complication at a moment where people would like to see a transaction occur, or if there's something mechanical about it that's inappropriate. I mean, I know we've excluded other things in the past through legislation, but
Well, RV certificates are supposed to be filed in the land records.
yeah.
So
Right.
that's a requirement in statute. I'm not saying it's always done.
Right, so this idea that, right, so your statute already requires that a builder or a homeowner or, you know, that someone is to record the RBES certificate in the land records. So the statutory provision that I included in the memorandum is that title validity not affected. A defect in marketable title shall not be created by a failure to issue the certificate or by failure to provide a certificate to the Department of Public Service or to record a certificate in the land records. So whether it's issued or not issued, or issued and not recorded, issued, not provided to the Public Service Department, none of those things under Vermont law are title defects.
By definition, right? Okay. Jim.
Can't hear you, Jim. You're still muted.
We can't hear you yet. See how
It's on his
optimistically I'm
phone.
phrasing that.
Must have his phone on a separate.
He's given up.
He waved us off.
Yeah, it doesn't show that I can unmute them for some reason.
Yeah.
It's grayed out.
Well, if we get that sorted out, we'll come back to your note.
Can you hear me now?
Oh,
Oh,
yes.
There we go.
Oh, sorry about that. One important point I think we need to make is the fact that a certificate filed does not mean that the house met everything, because I've seen contractors that I've inspected where they failed to meet even the air leakage numbers. They fill out the certificate. It's not really a pass or fail from what I have observed. So just having the certificate there, you can put what you did to the house, but did it actually meet the standard, especially with the Points Plus program and everything else, or what method of testing you used. So I think we need to be able to look at that a little bit better to make sure that what is being filed is a successful RB certificate. Thanks.
Chris?
I gotta say, having already seen inspections and permits before, this is where I get confused is, to me, this is a permitting issue, but there's no permit. And normally with permits, there also come inspections. And so in a normal, well, I would call a normal circumstance where you have permits and things like that, you issue a permit, you do what the permit says, you say somebody comes and inspects, you did that, and that's where you get the certification. I know we don't have that, and I know it's against the Vermont values and other stuff, but to try to tie this to a title or something, to me, just makes no sense, because there's not that whole process that you go through to kind of give it that elevated standing. So I don't know the solution to all this, but just in my experience in multiple states, I'm still kind of struggling with how to approach the Vermont approach and how to make this work. I know that's I'm tackling a lot there, but
Well, that's why we're here.
Well, one thing that a transaction does is it definitely focuses everyone's attention. So it's, it has a plus and a minus. The plus is that it creates an opportunity to get something clarified, recorded, resolved. From on the negative side, for some people, they could say, well, wait, you're holding up my transaction. So, which sort.
Well, I think you still you still are able to meet that test at the closing, because if the law is that we have to have the RB certificate for these homes that are within this time period, and a home is flagged to not have that, and the attorney finds out about it prior to closing, they work with the title insurance companies, but they're not going to close that home. So you have a problem at that point. If they find any code or I worked on a sale one time in a condo where the closing was delayed by 3 months because one of the other units was dealing with a mold problem, and they sued the association. So it had nothing to do with the individual unit, except for the product that they're buying. The association was under threat of lawsuit. So there's a number of reasons why you can stop a transaction without impacting or creating a defect to a title.
So just one code on that, but so is the goal to have a piece of paper in a file, or is the goal to have compliance with the code? Because to me, we're having these two separate conversations, because it seems like you can file a certificate. I like the sound of it, but as far as like whether or not you're actually in compliance with the code and achieving the state policies, that's another question. And so I think we're talking about the latter rather than the former, right? And that's the purpose of this.
Well, I mean, I think that if you have to file a certificate, A, you can't say you don't know about the requirements. B, I think you get into a whole nother issue of fraud and other things that you don't get if you don't ever have to file it. So I agree with you. I get that there's different levels, but I do think that filing a certificate does mean something, and not filing it does mean something, but it doesn't get you all the way there. I totally understand what you're saying on that.
Yeah, and if it is fraud, then what happens to
Sure. Yeah.
current owner and the
Yeah.
rules? Yeah. So anyway,
Well, that's how I would address Jim's concern, and what you're saying is absolutely right. If someone's filing a certificate, which is I think we're still debating whether that's the definite law or not. But if somebody files a certificate, they're representing the fact that they understand what the RVs are. And I think currently we don't have a speed ticket or take away your license thing. And I think that's why, putting some onus on the builder who's certifying it is certainly important.
All right, Liz, anything before, let me do anything to wrap up based on the discussion you've heard going on in the room?
Well, I suppose just to reiterate that, I know that there's a representative from the Vermont Association of Realtors, and I was just trying to pull up a sort of a standard Vermont realtor contract, because it's like what was said, it's not that these issues don't ultimately arise in a transaction, and there is a vehicle, the contract, to address issues between the buyer and seller in terms of the use of the property, the permitting of the property, and there's a specific term. Obviously, there's multiple iterations of contracts, but again, if people are using a realtor, generally you're going to see the same form contract within those transactions, and there is a section on non-compliance with permits, essentially, and how to work those out between buyer and seller. Sometimes there's an escrow. I wouldn't assert to say that I know what the solution is, but I think the other issue is that if you don't have compliance, what is the retroactive nature of the solution? Because ultimately, the idea of attempting to certify compliance on something that's already built seems like incredibly onerous, and again, probably placing a burden on innocent people, because obviously a homeowner isn't going to be able to certify whether their property is built to compliance to a building code.
Okay, thanks. I mean, one way I think we've looked at problems that have like there's a large universe of properties without RV certificate. At least one way to sort of build our way out of the problem is to address it going forward, sorting out the more gnarly things that are already part of a complicated record, be secondary. But I wanted to, so thanks, Liz, and thanks everyone. I want to do a little scheduling check-in. Sarah Phillips, I see you. Good morning. Thanks for joining us. It's my understanding that you have a limited window to be with us, and we also are going to hear from Cristelia. So I'm just wondering what your timing is and what Cristelia's timing is, to see if we can maybe shuffle the order, make sure we get to talk with both of you this morning.
Yes, good morning. I'm here with Steve Spatz, and I am scheduled till 10:30. That's what I have available today.
Cristelia, could you, I don't know what your schedule is like, could you swap places with Sarah and we'd come back to the banking side?
Sure, I'd be happy to do that.
Thank you so much for your help with that. Okay, so let's move then. We'll go to 3, Part B there, education and training on energy codes, Vermont Training Center update. With we have Sarah here, Matt's here, and Steve Spatz. So Sarah, why don't you lead us off? Thanks.
Great. Yeah, I'm just going to do a little bit of setting the table, and then I'm going to hand it off to Steve to talk a little bit more about where we're at. Some folks are familiar and others may not be. About a year and a half ago, well, first of all, I'm the director of the Office of Economic Opportunity. We administer the state's low-income home weatherization assistance program. And about a year and a half ago, our office applied to DOE for some funding to work on planning and launch for what we're calling, for lack of a better word, a weatherization training center. Our program receives funding from DOE and from lots of other sources to provide whole home, no cost home weatherization services to income eligible Vermonters. And part of our requirements are that we have certain training and certifications that we need to be able to, just to be clear, OEO itself doesn't hire and weatherize homes. We administer the funding through 5 agencies that deliver weatherization services. 4 of them are community action agencies, right? So those 5 agencies, we put a lot of requirements on them per our federal requirements, and so that they deliver quality work. And some of that requires certain certifications, in fact, that they have to drive to New York State to go be able to get. So that's a bummer. It's particularly when we're trying to scale up the program. At the same time, weatherization as a whole in the field, not just the low-income home weatherization program, has a lot of needs to grow and recruit and retain a more diverse workforce if we're truly going to achieve weatherization at scale in the way that our climate plan requires us to do. We have a lot of smaller, I would say, boutique, great programs in Vermont that do training for new workers. I just said that for incumbent workers, we have to send them out of state to get some of the training that's required. And what we need at this time to really kind of scale up weatherization in the state is a little bit more of a super highway on-ramp as opposed to a bunch of small rural back roads. So a training center in Vermont we see as an opportunity to create a more collaborative infrastructure around pulling together a hub to really grow and diversify, recruit, and retain the climate workforce that we need. So when we call it a weatherization training center, we're of course focused on that core work around weatherization, but we see a training center as an opportunity to also do work around training and certifications around renewables, around HVAC, and a lot of other sort of ancillary fields. So we applied for this funding to do some planning. Core to our work is the idea that we need more than 30 and 40 something white men to want to do weatherization jobs. So when I say diversify, that's what I mean. And so we needed a planning process to help us think about how we deliver training for weatherization in Vermont differently than we have done in the past. We were successful in getting those funds and kicked off the work last spring. We have a pretty robust steering committee that involves folks that you might think. Part of our partners working with Steve Spatz and his team over at Efficiency Vermont, they're really driving a lot of the research and planning and business plan process. The first year of the grant funding that we received is really all about a planning process, engagement, and really delivering at the end of year 1 a business plan on how a weatherization training center will be sustainable in Vermont. If we do that, then DOE releases another big chunk of money, and we'll issue an RFP and hire somebody, a contractor, or contract with somebody to actually launch and start a training center. So our steering committee is Vermont State University. We've got some folks from the industry, home construction. We've got our weatherization partners at the table. Paul Zabriskie sitting on the steering committee. We've got Vermont Works for Women, Vermont Adult Learning and Resource, all providers that deliver weatherization readiness training. And some others I'm forgetting, Steve, but I think I'm going to turn it over at that point to Steve to kind of talk about where we're at in the planning process. We have a webinar tomorrow where we're going more in depth than what we're able to do with you all today, and you're all welcome to join that. And would love to make sure you're up to speed on where the planning's at and get your input and thoughts about what else we might be doing.
Great. Thanks, Sarah. If you would send the link to the webinar to Kelly, ask her to send it off to our distribution list. Maybe people can jump in.
I think Kelly or Richard probably already
Yeah.
has it. Maybe
Or
could
sign
forward
up.
it on
Okay.
to your group.
I'll send that.
Thanks. So
Great.
the other quick question is, in the training center, are you involving community technical education centers? Are they part of the mix?
Yeah, they were absolutely a part of our application to DOE initially. They haven't, perhaps for lack of bandwidth, they're going through a lot of their own restructuring work haven't been participating in our steering committee, but it is a part of the conversations we've been having to think about a training center in the way that it integrates within our current workforce development infrastructure, as opposed to standing up something new entirely. It will need a home, so to speak, and we do see the tech centers as an important partner. So would love to have them more involved, but just again, recognize their bandwidth. And also just want to recognize on the tech center side, right, it's both the high school side and the adult side. And the adult side of things, they have been a little bit more involved in the conversation. And Steve may have a better update on that because his team at EBT has really been leading the outreach work, which is pretty robust at this point.
Right. Well, I know that one thing that we talked about maybe 2 years ago on the weather, when we were doing the weatherization work, was could we shift away from weatherization training to like building science and rebuilding trades? So there was a career path that was broader than weatherization alone. Is that pretty much the way things have evolved? Or that's still
Yeah,
work in progress?
I would say we're definitely, I think there's some decision points over the next 6 months around the career pathways and the certifications that a training center will be working to train towards. And so Steve, again, I'm gonna maybe hand it over to Steve, who can get more in the meat of things. I'm doing a little bit more of setting the table. If it's all right, I'll pass it to him.
Sure. Thanks so much.
Right. Thank you, Sarah.
Good morning,
Can
Steve.
everybody hear me okay?
Yeah.
Great. So I'm Steve Spatz with Efficiency Vermont. I work in our account management team here at Efficiency Vermont, and my primary role with that team is I work directly with our residential contractor base, mainly through our Efficiency Excellence Network, our EEN. I do a lot of training here on behalf of my work in the EEN around code, building science, and in support of our weatherization program, the Home Performance with Energy Star program. So working around the interests of what we're all discussing here today and the work of what we are doing, dovetails with the operation of Sarah's program, the Low Income Weatherization Program. So our work in this has been in partnership with OEO and Sarah's team, to do the research, do the outreach, and project development for what a training center might look like. I'm going to share screen here, if you have access to the video, of just some slides that this is going to be what we're using for our webinar tomorrow, but I'll just jump through a few of them for context. So for partners on this, our steering committee members, as Sarah had mentioned, are a variety of different organizations that have interest in the training space. They're already either offering trainings that support weatherization in the construction trades, or are in support of career and adult learning and high school learning as well. So those are our partners in this project in the steering team. So our role in this, my partner on the project here now is Laura Capps, which many of you may know from work that Laura had done in a weatherization or workforce development research effort that she and I were a part of a couple of years ago, looking at the future landscape for weatherization, training needs, and career trajectory. So Laura and I are working on this now. Allison Donovan had been with us until her job role shifted recently. So where we're at in the project right now, we have a community engagement plan, which is a part of our webinar that we're going to be running tomorrow. We're in the process of a very robust set of outreach involving interviews, surveys, and this webinar to present the project broadly to the construction community here in Vermont and other organizations that have an interest in this type of effort in workforce development and could be strategic partners in this work. The reach here is also, to Sarah's point, to broaden the networking of who we're bringing into the trades and into weatherization. So we're into that work, and we'll be developing further reports on that through the end of September. We just completed over the past few months a really in-depth look and interview process with training center operators around the country that are currently operating. A general theme here was that through the ARA funding opportunity in the early 2000s, quite a few training centers were stood up with the availability of that funding around the country. The majority of these training centers that were stood up and are still operating are essentially their core operations is to provide the ongoing training and certification requirements to those states' low-income weatherization programs. And that's what Sarah was mentioning here at the beginning of those ongoing structured, requirements that those organizations need state by state to continue to get DOE funding for weatherization. So that's pretty much a core deliverable of any of these training centers. Many training centers were stood up with that ARA funding. A subset of them have continued to remain viable and sustainable on their own since that funding opportunity passed by. So there are some, characteristics of those training centers that we were able to put together, some commonalities, some differences. Some of them have, facilities or a facility that have classrooms and labs and mock-ups of assemblies and equipment in a building to train hands-on with. Some of the centers do training actually in the field. They have mobile training units that they go out on site and train employees or new workers with. A combination of those things, online learning. The actual instructors involved in these programs, most of them are employees of the organization that runs the training center. Some of them, though, are subcontracting out for trainers because there is kind of a rotating need for skilled trainers, and you don't want to take those skilled people out of the field producing work to train. So there's kind of a revolving process with that. Industry aligned training certifications and affiliations, IREC and BPI are two of the things that relate specifically to weatherization as far as industry credentials and accredited learning objectives and ongoing certifications. NCCER is another pre-apprenticeship the constructions trade building model or training model that's employed in some of these, as well as HBI is another one run by the Home Builders Institute. We didn't see that as a deliverable from the training centers that we looked at, but we are aware of other training organizations using that as a pre-apprenticeship sort of model for the trades. So a variety of different structures to what we saw being delivered out in the rest of the country. A variety of different student types that are being trained. A lot of the people being trained through these programs are incumbent workers of existing weatherization assistance program crews, either state programs or similar to how Vermont runs, they're in subcontractors to the state program. Recruitment into the trades, only a couple of these organizations or training centers were actively doing recruitment. And the one that was most productive with that was housed within the organization of a university system, a college system at Penn College. So a lot of what we are seeing in that research we did nationally was, training, continuing that core deliverable, structured deliverable need for training, education, and continuing ed for the weatherization assistance program. Some training being done outside of that model, and where that training outside of that model had some traction or some consistency as far as volume goes, it was related to the state's requirements for contractor trades training as well in those states. So mandatory training or licensure type training for the construction trades outside of weatherization in those states. But then again, as far as actually worker recruitment into these programs, that was not a deliverable from the majority of the training centers. Again, the one program that was actively doing a recruitment program as a part of what they were delivering as a service was through the Clean Energy Center at Penn College. As far as how this looks, as an example, as Sarah mentioned, NYSWADA, which is the New York State Weatherization Directors Association, is a facility located in Syracuse, New York. This is a training center that is funded by the state of New York to support New York State's Weatherization Assistance Program directly. It's been around for quite a while. They have a warehouse type facility in Syracuse that houses building assembly mock-ups, a variety of different combustion equipment. So it's very much a hands-on lab facility that they train at. Some of these training centers are, as I said, primarily working within the state that they're located. But NYSWADA and the other example we looked at here, CHP out of Charlottesville, Virginia, do contract work out of state. So they will train staff and weatherization workers from neighboring states or regional weatherization assistance programs. So NYSWADA is used at that purpose. Or Sarah's program, their subcontractors send their staff to New York State for training at their facility. The NYSWADA program does have 2 other buildings that they use as labs as well. Build actual, homes that they will do training in, and zonal testing and assembly diagnostics, etc. There's a cooperative ownership structure and a lease sort of agreement with community colleges that is the ownership model for how they use these buildings and have access to them. Some of the training centers we talked to did have similar arrangements where they had buildings that or agreements, MOUs with homeowners or other building property owners to use buildings for on-site training. CHP in Virginia has a modern, very well put together training facility with a lot of labs located in it. But then again, they also are very well known for having a business model that is actively seeking out contract work to train around the Northeast and along the central Atlantic coast. So they do a lot of sending trainers to other states for training. OEO's program has used CHP. Other weatherization operators in the Northeast have used CHP as well.
Scott,
Yep.
I want to just jump back in for a moment to ask 2 things. One, can you talk about the role of the RVs in all this? Are they
Sure.
Not assumed, but explicitly referenced? It's part of a quote unquote like curriculum. And can you talk about how that is, how that outreach works in terms of Vermont's builders?
Sure. So to speak to that, we have a core deliverable need here, which I'll jump to this side for, which is the ongoing requirements for training for the DOE-funded low-income weatherization assistance program for the existing staff and workers in that program, and the QA quality assurance side of the operations of that program. Efficiency Vermont's Home Performance with Energy Star program is very similar to how the WAP program works for certification and requirement, but not as career trajectory oriented as the weatherization assistance program is. So these are specific deliverables, specific objectives for that weatherization career path. As far as how RBs relates to this, RBs applies to existing buildings as it does to new construction. I mean, the structure and format of RBs is really primarily oriented towards requirements for new construction. But if you are, alterations in RBs does require adherence to RBs as well for modifying existing structures. So there is definitely, the core deliverable out of the weatherization training is fundamental building science. The core curriculum that everything is being taught to is understanding buildings as a system and the dynamics of the different building components and mechanical systems on the building assemblies, durability, occupant health, safety, and comfort. That's the core tenet to the training delivered through BPI, IREC around how to approach modifying buildings. That same core deliverable knowledge base aligns with what RBs would seek to achieve for new construction or building retrofit. So that's where the deliverables for this align with the broader needs outside of just weatherization, but just general, the physics of how buildings work as it relates to our residential market here. In that path of that conversation, this is a deliverable that came out of the workforce development research project that Laura Capps and I were involved with in 2021, the weatherization workforce plan. A part of that was to look at the potential of what an apprenticeship model may look like built around weatherization or career trajectory aimed for the private market for around weatherization. So this general framework here, which is just kind of thinking about how we're looking at this, builds upon that basic building science fundamental knowledge base towards different pathways a individual could take with that core competency into different career paths within the residential trades. So this is something that we're looking at as a part of the potential deliverable of this training center model as well.
Yeah, I might just add one thing, which is just to say that the weatherization training center has at its core that it will need to meet the needs of the low-income home weatherization assistance program. You heard Steve talk about that a little bit. But if that's the only thing we're doing, it won't be a sustainable business model.
Right.
That's why we don't have one. But we see an enormous amount of opportunity in terms of the knowledge and skills that we want a range of workers to have in Vermont as we scale up work and around climate action, but also dovetailing on what this committee is talking about, building energy code, right? Is like, do people have the skills needed to do the work? One of the things that you heard Steve say that I think is important to understand is the research and the learning and the interviews of the training centers around the country really revealed to us that the only time people use the training center is when they're required to do that.
Yep.
That it's not a business model to say we're going to build this thing and people are going to magically go take the training that they need. So, but we want you all to have awareness that, so one of the things is, one of the questions for us is who else will be required to have the training, take the kind of training that this training center will offer. That is a part of a fundamental question for us in the business model. Is it just going to be the weatherization program staff? That's not enough to be sustainable to build this. Is it also going to be regional? Is it also going to include folks through the EVT network? Is it also going to be folks, more broadly in the field who need to understand building science and have ongoing requirements for training to maintain their certification or their qualifications? So I think those are some of the questions that we see kind of dovetailing and overlapping with the work that you all are doing.
Yep.
Sure. One thing I can imagine from time spent on job sites is that people are making a living by being at that job. And if they have to stop and go get trained, unless the employer is going to pay them to go basically keep them on payroll for the day they go get training or days, then we end up with a tension between those two people. Yes, they'd like to know more, but they don't want to take a ding on their paycheck. So wanted to hear from you on that, and then Matt is ready to chip in this one.
Yeah, that is certainly a theme that exists in any of the conversations we've had with training center operators around the country, and that's a reality. It's just a reality of being a business owner and trying to keep your clients happy and keep things moving. Through the DOE network program, there are training and technical assistance dollars that are available to support the ongoing training requirements for the weatherization assistance program operators. Those dollars are, and Sarah, correct me if I'm off base on any of this, but those dollars are available to do exactly what you're speaking to, which is cover the time and expense wages of the staff to attend trainings, to travel to trainings. It still means that the weatherization operator has to figure out when they can afford, quote unquote, to take them out of the field for the training, but the cost and expense and hourly wages are covered through those dollars. That's not a model that exists for your general private individual contractor here in the state. Or in many states for that matter, depending on what your affiliations are, what trade organization maybe you'd be associated with. But that's certainly a factor. If there's not a mandatory, obligation to attend training, and a contractor has to determine how to pay for that on their own accord. The carrot versus stick model is, how do you make it as attractive as possible to get them to those courses and see the benefit in it, and not have it be a net, in their minds, even though they're gaining a lot educationally, not have it be a net loss for the time away. So that's 100% a factor that came back to us through that research that we did.
Great. Matt Musgrave.
Yeah, I just want to point out the Associated General Contractors has probably the largest training facility in the state of Vermont. We do actually skills training in addition to safety training and leadership training. There are another number of other facilities, including our technical colleges and such, that do provide this level of training. And I would agree that demand would be probably pretty low for something separate and distinct, because the majority of employers that are, I think, we talk about with contractor registration, everything like that, professionals, they have a robust training program. I could name 100 of them off the tip of my tongue right now, where they have earn when you learn programs where someone can actually go work a full day. They have programs where they can do either online or in class. They get paid off hours to do this. While they're doing those different programs and certifications, they're actually stepping up in their skill level, which gives them more money at the job. So they're right. There isn't a huge amount of demand for a per se statewide thing. And that's why we talk about forcing people to go, because there are millions and millions of dollars invested by employers throughout the state on this stuff. I just wanted to bring that up, because when we have these conversations, it sounds like there isn't any of this going on, but there definitely is.
Yeah, and this is another aspect of the training center design here is, there are already resources, training programs, facilities operating within the state, but yet there hasn't been a kind of an umbrella overall sort of approach to take to organizing that and having it accessible to as many people as possible who could take advantage of it. And I think there is a certain distinction to be aware of in this conversation as well, as far as access to these sorts of opportunities and training. The bulk of the single family residential construction market is a contractor base of 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 person, quote unquote, businesses. Those sorts of general contractors and residential contractors don't have the overall net income and operating budget to support a level of, career trajectory and training that exists with larger commercial construction firms that have that ability to be able to deliver a training and career development trajectory for their employees. And, for the residential market, that is a significant portion, if not the bulk of the contractor base we're talking about here, is a very, small employers that would need more support services to be able to recruit and or train incumbent workers.
Chris Anthony, and then Sam.
Sarah, are you still with us?
You're muted, Sarah.
I'm here, Chris. I'm here.
Hey, Sarah. So I'm struck. I remember from the climate council discussion about the needs to increase the workforce. Do you have any visibility, or anybody else on the call, as far as what, I guess, kind of the youth pipeline is, like what we're seeing at the career centers and elsewhere, as far as like numbers and enrollment, and then also diversity?
Yeah, I wouldn't be the person who would have my finger
Okay.
on the pulse of that. I can talk about our program specifically. In the past couple of years, we've had about a 20% vacancy rate on our crew. We've done a lot of work that's our 5 agencies we work with, done a lot of work with them around recruitment and wages and, statewide marketing campaign. We're up to, I think, about a 10% vacancy rate on our crew. Still not great, but much better. And I would say part of that work has also been to try and diversify the crew. A lot of work we're doing around training, creating more inclusive workspaces and some other things. And we have seen more demographic diversity on crew as well, although it's still probably about 90% white and about 90% men. So.
When you get, Sarah, on projects that, the OEO projects, when you enter a property, even if you're doing just, is it always comprehensive so that any remodeling needs, you're not only addressing the portion of that structure that you're working on, but you always necessarily look at the whole? So in other words, if you're in for an inch, you're in for a mile. It's always the full structure.
Yeah, to some extent that's true. We do readiness work, right? So if there are things that are preventing weatherization in the home related to home repair, other structural issues in the home or vermiculite remediation, we do that work. That work is usually subbed out. It's not usually through the 5 agencies they sub out for that work. They also look at heating systems and obviously ventilation, a whole lot of other health and safety work related to weatherization. We don't have the authority or the funds to kind of go beyond that. That's pretty whole home, I would say. But if, for instance, somebody also needed railings in their bathroom to prevent an injury, right? That would be a whole home approach, but our program doesn't do that unless we have extra funds. On occasion, we do.
Sure. Okay. Thanks.
Or if somebody needed new flooring, we wouldn't do new flooring, for instance.
New flooring if it were a tripping hazard?
Not unless we had outside funds to support it.
Thanks. Sandy?
I work with a group called Build Safe Vermont, and we are focusing more and more on residential builder training, both building codes and energy codes. We kind of combine them into one 6-hour class. Our experience is that most home builders are self-employed, partly because of the whole reporting of workman's comp issue. And that they're very used to not traveling far, partly because they all day long are having to go back and forth between a lumberyard and a job site or multiple job sites. So what seems to be working is to really regionalize the state to a large degree. And I think there are like 15 or 20 tech centers right now. And I think that they're using the tech centers where more and more of these builders will be graduates of makes a lot of sense because they probably are familiar with the building or people or at least the area, other people going to the class. And if they could think about it like first day of boat season, that they go every year, go over to get their training, I think we have a model that people might actually get used to doing. They will complain a lot because they do not get paid for days that they're not on a job site. But if they could build it in their business model, if the key is not having to travel far. Thanks.
One quick comment on the workforce too. We dealt with, not in your committee, potentially one of your committees, we dealt with the issue of misclassification of workers in a bill. I think it was S-182 that passed a few years ago. And it dealt with the fact that builders have chosen for a long period of time to work in the subcontractor model, where I'm the general contractor. I hire Ted to be my painter. I hire you to be my framer. I hire you to put in my kitchen. And I don't have to pay you unemployment insurance. I don't have to pay workers' comp on any one of you. And until 3 years ago, there wasn't a very good way of dealing with that. And in fact, if we talk to the AG's office, it is actually a huge issue of misclassification in the state of Vermont. So when we talk about really small crews, that's what you're seeing. Your company may have 3 employees, but you still need 20 people to complete the project. And I think that's, again, it goes back to professionalizing the industry, following the law the way that we should. I think the contractor registry was a good way to start that process, and the misclassification piece as well. So I just want to point that out as material fact, because if we're acting like everybody's out there despair and they don't know what they're doing, it doesn't necessarily pass the test.
I have a really brief example, which I think is a great example. We offered a class in January in Montpelier to the builders. And suddenly at the last moment, we had a venue change. We couldn't, so we had to move the class to White River Junction, which is another 40 minutes, 45 minutes on the interstate. All but 2 contractors canceled. And I think we had something like 25 or 30 people. All but 2 canceled. They wouldn't go to White River Junction. So we had to schedule another course in May in Montpelier, and they all came to that. So that, I mean, it's so drastically distance related. Yeah.
So Sarah, or Steve, or Matt Sharp, we haven't heard from you. I know you're with your colleagues there. Anything more on the training side of things?
Well, I can speak to what Efficiency Vermont is doing currently on RB's, CB's training, if you'd like to hear about that.
Sure, please.
So most of Efficiency Vermont's work is resource acquisition, meaning we claim savings for giving out incentives for efficiency work. There is a subset of budget, much smaller amount, where we are asked to provide RB's and CB's support, and that includes running the ECAC, which is the Energy Code Assistance Center. We answer the hotline. We have energy advisors and energy consultants talk to builders, owners, and architects who call in, and we dish out the handbooks to anyone who requests them if they don't want to get them online. As part of our work with RBCBs, we provide training. So in 2021, there were 16 RB's trainings and 7 CB's trainings. In 22, that was 11 and 3. And part of the reason for that drop was the higher, we had to use some of that budget for the code update process that was happening for the new code that's now to be 2024. So we do those trainings, Steve Spatz does most of them. And we also record them for live webinar viewing on our website. So people can go back and be trained by the recording at any time they'd like. So that's kind of the formal energy code support that we provide. We also run a new construction program, which is a voluntary participation that builders and owners can enroll in. With that, we do aim for a higher level of efficiency than what code requires. But with that program, we offer, personalized support to the enrollee on the energy code, but as well as building science and just good building practices to achieve their goals. So there's some code training within that. Now that program, a few years ago, there was about 30% participation. And so we saw a direct correlation with how much code compliance there was at that time. A few years ago, that in the most recent baseline study, there was 12% participation in that program, and 12% of all new builds were participating. And then with program changes, that happened recently, we don't really know, but we expect it to be a very, single digits type of participation, low single digits. And part of the reason for that drop in participation is, an increase in the performance requirement of the program. We have to stay above code because, again, our programs get supported by energy savings, and that's energy savings above a baseline that is close to code. And so as our program ramps up and has more stringent criteria, not as many people participate, and we don't get to reach as many builders and owners. And the other part of what we do is we participate in the code update process. So like I said, some of the budget for that support, we collect content to make recommendations on based on our interactions with people who call both the code hotline and participate in the program. We review on draft code and make comments, and we provide edit feedback on the handbook. And I think this year we're actually going to be the prime resource to update the handbook for the new code. So that about sums up what we do on an ongoing basis. In the future, this committee could ask for efficiency utilities to do more. We're currently only budgeted and asked to do a certain amount, and that's what we do. And then the other piece is, as the our new construction program, again, we're saving energy to justify the operation of that program, and it has to be cost effective. And so if there were any changes to how Efficiency Vermont is funded regarding just meeting code, then that could open up our ability to serve more people. But that's all, not currently in the plan, from my understanding.
And if so I get it, as the code goes up, if you're only allowed to spend on projects that are going to meet or exceed code, then the number of projects that you can support may shrink over time, right?
Right. We're not funded to meet code to help people meet code.
I saw you on a job site last week. So was that an example of the new construction program consulting services you offer?
Right. Yeah. So that project, we're limited somewhat in what we can offer for support, and in terms of financial incentives, because again, the improvements have to be cost effective. And so I was up there really talking about air sealing and providing technical support, which is one of the things we can provide more of as our, if we can't provide a actual cash incentive to achieve something, what we can do is talk with builders and provide some resources in building science and best practices.
And is that statutorily mandated that it's only savings have to be only claimed for exceeding code?
Getting beyond my knowledge of how everything works, but my understanding is, Efficiency Vermont has to be cost effective. So, with what energy savings we do claim, we can't spend too much to achieve those savings. And because the energy savings are low for new construction, our costs have to remain low.
Great. Okay. Thanks so much, Scott.
Yeah, so just Matt, following up on Senator's question about, or your response about being on site, is that something you all do sort of routinely? Is that how much would you say that's part of the support services that you offer?
Different projects require different amounts of effort, I guess you could say. And so it's a case by case, what is needed to help that project be better and to get some energy savings for the expense of being on site, or or the expense of offering a cash incentive. So I don't know the percentage of on site. Certainly on the residential side, so that project wasn't a residential project. On the residential side, we don't go on site very much at all, and actually maybe not even. Yeah, it's very little now. It used to be a lot more. Back when we were participating 30% market share, we were going to every new construction site that enrolled twice, one at pre-drywall and one at final inspection. As the program has trimmed its fat, so to speak, or spend less money because the energy savings are so low, we've turned to a model of not going on site very much at all, and leaning on giving some incentives to builders to hire a home energy rater so they can go on site and do that work. The incentive is modest, but it's sort of more money better spent, I guess, to do it that way.
Have they been
One
using
thing
that? Have they been using that incentive? I guess what I'm wondering is, A, are we getting it? getting a cramp, sorry. Are we getting an energy consultant on site? And B, if that's happening a lot less, do you notice a difference in the quality of the work that's getting done?
I don't know if Steve wanted to say something, but as far as knowing, I don't think we know the difference because we're not there, they're not participating. You know, that drop off in participation because of the program changes means we're just not there seeing the quality.
And there is a distinction between how we're working with contractors as well, too. You know, Matt's been speaking specifically to our residential new construction program and the enrollment of a project in our program, the support services provided by that. We do offer and provide, you know, service and support as needed, and to whatever extent, you know, one of our contractors seeking from us for those who are enrolled in our efficiency excellence network. So if you're an EEN contractor like Jim Bradley is here, you know, that Jim calls with a question or something he wants to discuss about a project, get into something technically, or have myself as his account manager come out on the job to talk about something or look through something. 100% we're supporting our contractors that are partners with us in that EEN program in that way. So that's a lot of what our account management team does. And a lot of our support in the account management side of things is with our HVAC heat pump contractors. But we are also, you know, providing that support for our residential new construction builders, EEN members, and our home performance contractors as well. So we're there to help them, support them, whatever need they would like, project by project basis, with some limitations to what Matt's talking about as well.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
But just noting that's a very limited amount of builders compared to everyone operating in the state.
Exactly.
Everyone's welcome to join, but we're just not reaching very many.
I think Colin was first. And then.
Okay. Colin, you can just introduce yourself to the group and we'll jump right. We don't always do non-group member discussion during it, but if this is right on the topic, if you can be brief, because we're running behind, that'd be great, but we'd love to hear from you.
Excellent. Thank you all. Colin Frisbee, Sterling Homes, residential builder, Chittenden County. I'll be sitting in for Sandra next meeting next week. So you're paying attention. I just want to make sure that people understand that at some level here recently, we're somewhat talking past each other. I think everything is true what Matt said, and that we, for the entire history of Efficiency Vermont, had always worked with the residential new construction program while it existed. As residential energy code has come up, Efficiency Vermont's ability to provide that training and support services was taken away. And so now those of us who are trying to use that services are no longer able to, when we're talking about implementing this code and the code getting much more stringent, the requirements for additional training and for additional building science and additional expertise is going through the roof as we get to these higher and higher RB standards, and the training has gone away. There is training, as Steve alluded to, if you're in the EEN, again, exceeding code, but not for those of us who are trying to meet code. Primarily, this RBs, as everyone has talked about, is for the RBs part is for residential new construction, and it does apply to remodels and such, but primarily new construction. We keep jacking the standard, raising the bar on new construction without providing the training services. If we go to one of these other training models, that would be fantastic. Certainly home builders and builders like us were trained to work through Efficiency Vermont, and that Efficiency Vermont was a go-to place for answers. No longer the case for builders like us trying to build as affordable workforce housing as possible.
I guess I'm Richard. A quick comment. If it seems like, you know, one of the challenges here is as the code ratchets up, there's less savings available. if the savings were measured from the average compliance rate rather than code, wouldn't that open up a lot more opportunity and be able to provide more services back to builders like Colin was just suggesting? Is it, it's a problem with diminishing savings, and maybe it's where we set the baseline.
Well, and I
by-
think
by having a-
PSP has the ability to affect that charter or potentially change how, maybe Kelly, I misunderstood in our conversation a couple months ago, but that there is some level that is driven, and perhaps at this point with code being this high, that that metric isn't the best metric for how to accomplish this.
Yeah.
Please,
Real
Kelly.
quick. We are in this current budget and goal setting process. We have some different phases of it, and one is to look at the new construction program and how savings are claimed. So yes, it can be modified. To Richard's point, we did look at that a while ago about compliance rates, but I just want to remind everyone, just because a home doesn't fully comply doesn't mean it doesn't comply with anything, right? Like it might just be one measure, like, you know, a lot of times the basement insulation, right? That might be what's missed. So I don't want it to be assumed that there's a lot of savings there, even if you go by lack of compliance rate. But we are going to look at how the buildings or how the programs might be able to be modified to not have it sheerly based on savings claims because of the issues that it causes.
Well, it gets complicated when we look at funding streams and what they can and cannot be allowed to be applied to because of cross subsidy issues, stuff like that. So sometimes the funding doesn't keep up with the evolving needs of the marketplace.
Exactly.
And Kelly, you correct me if I'm wrong, because I've been away from the savings claim side for a bit, but I remember a time when the baseline was actually from the baseline assessment of what people are actually building. I think that's still the case, but we're also seeing what people are actually building has been increasing in efficiency, and that's
Right.
where the savings drop really happens.
Right.
Because
Yes,
if you
I
do
think-
look at that assessment, you know, yes, if one foundation is not insulated, that means a non-compliance, but the actual efficiency of that home, if you look at all that average of the baseline study, is actually not that far from code from a performance perspective.
Musgrave.
Two quick things. One, I'm wearing my VECA shirt today, although I'm not here representing them. It's Vermont Independent Electrical Contractors Association. I definitely want to give a shout out to Efficiency Vermont for working with us. I'm actually going to be sitting in on the works building committee meeting tomorrow. So they've been doing a lot of work. They've done some trainings for both RVs and CVs with our members for free, which is great. If that program can continue, we'd love that. My second question, or my second piece, was I'm trying to understand, is what we're saying that it's not possible for a residential contractor to find training in these international standards? Or is it that we're saying that we want to fund the training for those individuals? Because those are two different conversations. And I'm not sure what I'm hearing right now. Is it that they don't want to pay for the training, or there is no availability to get the training, whether it be online or in person? I mean, this is a national, international code, right?
There's no pressure for not meeting. I mean, there's no, the reasons for going to a training are not as compelling as staying on the job and earning the dollar. I mean,
Well, and Richard, aren't we talking about Arby's here? And if Arby's is not an international code and is not an international standard, there's not somewhere else you can go to get Arby's training. Arby's is unique to Vermont.
it is. It's based on the international code, but it is unique to Vermont. You're right.
Heavily unique
Yeah.
to Vermont.
So again, the question remains, is it that we're looking to have training centers for profit, or we're looking to do free trainings for people? I think that's the nature of the question, because then we look at that. versus other professions. And there isn't really a lot of other professions that we're paying for people to get trained. And I understand the work, I understand the not wanting to leave the job site piece, but really, does the painter need to be trained in that? Does the person that's putting in the kitchen countertops need to be trained in that? Or is it the general contractor that's running the program? And so what is our population of people that really need to get that training? I'm struggling to understand. I support, putting together programs where there is a need, but for-profit industries just generally aren't trained by government.
Doesn't this get back to the question of what is a building trade and who oversees them in Vermont, and whoever oversees them hopefully is making consistent training across the state for all trades, so that when a framer or an insulator or a painter, when they sheetrocker and taper, when they show up at the site, they all speak the same details. And it seems to me that not all of those are licensed trades, but certainly electricians, plumbers dealing with the heating systems, those are all building trades. And it seems to me, one thing I've been trying to suggest is that why it would be good to have a state oversight from an authority who really is familiar with construction, would be to set up those standards that dovetail with the regulation and make sure, let's talk about electricians, that do they even have continuing ed right now? Yes, they do, don't they?
Yes, do.
So that maybe so many hours in Vermont a year is dedicated to RBs or CBs or some new topic within that. And that could easily be set by the licensing authority and just say to whoever provides education, you've got to do this year. It seems like it should be very simple, and it is simple in other states. Connecticut is right at the top of this. They have actually made it so that you cannot amend the international codes, so that they can adopt them as soon as they come out. And as soon as they come out, there's a new version of the training, and poof, everyone gets trained. The average building inspector can go through any building of any building type and inspect it, and they're done. I mean, it's just like, it's weird how Vermont is so far behind the national curve on education. On the other hand, we're at the front of the curve with our building code, with our energy codes. So it's weird that we have like a Champagne budget energy code, and we're below Anheuser-Busch on the with our education.
Thanks. I mean, I think some of it is so many people in the trades they migrate into it, they learn on the job, they get hired young, they move around. It's a home, largely my exposure to it, other than the bigger contractors, is that it's a homegrown model. And maybe that's probably because we are so rural and spread out. It doesn't have anyway, sorry, Kelly.
Yeah, I think Matt hit the nail on the head, obviously, like, if the big thing is if you're not required to do it, are you gonna do it? And then, like, I think that's the first decision. If you're not required to do it, I think it has to be free. And I mean, maybe beyond have to be free, has to be pay people to come. But if you're required to do it, then you're required to do it. And I don't think having a authority having jurisdiction or compliance officers, that doesn't solve that. Like, if you don't have a licensure or reason that you have to do it, then you're completely carrot. And I think you'll never get to the fully participation fully on training. I mean, Efficiency Vermont said they've had trainings forever, and what their attendance is declining. It's not that it's not there and available, it's just not being utilized.
So that goes back to the contractor understanding what their responsibilities are, right? So, whether the training center is in Vermont or it's in Pennsylvania or if it's online, the contractor doesn't know that they're supposed to go, then that's really on the authority. Right now, the authority is OPR. And, I think we have OPR coming in at some point.
Next week.
I mean, and I think that's why I raised the suggestion that OPR is really our first stop to talking about that, because if they don't know that they're supposed to be complying with the RVs, they don't know that they're supposed to be getting the training for the RVs, then therefore they don't go. And it goes back to the golf course analogy. You can't bring your own alcohol to the golf course. But that's the education that I think is missing. And that's like the first step is people understanding it. The next step is then finding a place to get the training and paying for it. And I think that's, we're going right to the champagne, which is building this model that it force everybody to come into. Whereas they're for-profit businesses. Real estate agents have to go get their own training. Attorneys get their own training. Electricians get their own training. I mean, we sell training to electricians for fire code, fire alarms. So that's all paid by the contractor. So that's just where understanding that they need to do it is step one.
Correct.
Well, I think we have the training available, the people with the expertise and the understanding and the knowledge base to deliver on the objectives of all the things relating to the conversation in the room. It's going to be differential between trades and need, et cetera, market. But I mean, the core deliverable of the training content is accessible. It's the structure of how it's delivered and how it becomes accessible and to awareness. That is, the crux of the problem here. I think that's the other piece of this, looking at it from the contractor side, is that it's not a ignorance in general, as I see it from my experience working in this space, is that there's not a willful ignorance generally from the contracting community about not understanding how the code works or how physics work on buildings. That's what this comes back to, is understanding the existential threat to the structure, to the occupants, and therefore, our infrastructure, our tax base, and everything else relating to buildings that are built to fall apart or are retrofit, unknowing of these dynamics at play. It's a threat to the business, to the individual, from a legal standpoint, just from a, quality of workmanship. This is not willful ignorance as I see it. It is an embedded lack of structure to allow access to an understanding of why it's important to have this level of education and ongoing continuing ed. And to the people in this room, to what Matt and his organization is able to offer, what Efficiency Vermont has consistently offered over the years for training and educational resources and technical expertise, to our partners working on this training center project, there's a lot of resources available. And I mean, the key deliverable out of this training center project, to circle back and kind of close the loop on that for what I was putting forth here today, is that, this training center opportunity that this funding from the DOE, this grant offers, is a launch pad to build a platform off of to do all the things we're talking about in this room. It's the sustainability model of that for the long term. There's a core deliverable of training and certification that comes from this project specific to weatherization. But as Sarah said, and we've understood from the research, that deliverable is not going to be enough to sustain a training center, quote unquote, as we're talking about here in Vermont. We have to be delivering something beyond that. And Field of Dreams, we can't just build it and they will come. There has to be the motivation for them to come. And I mean, we're looking at other, this opportunity of, if we offer a credentialized deliverable of training in Vermont at this training center, if it's a viable model that other neighboring states will send their staff to train here, because it's something they don't have access to in their own state. So again, it's what we're delivering and how to bring the people to the table that this project in particular offers.
Great.
I'm going to wait until we get to the AHJ conversation. Thanks.
All right. Well, thanks so much. We've gone a little long in this, but there's a lot to this piece of the puzzle. And, I appreciate everyone's chipping in. And now I'd like
Thanks for the opportunity. I'll step off.
Thank Steve,
Take care.
Matt, Sarah, if she's still on, and I'd like to turn to the day's most patient witness, guest, Chris Delia. So we're looping back to the banking side of things.
Good morning, Senator. Good morning, committee. It feels very much like we're on legislative time. You just wait to see when you get called up. So I appreciate the opportunity to visit with you, and certainly we'll be visiting during the legislative session on this issue. As Representative Campbell knows, we've talked about this for a few years now, and maybe at some point we find a solution. I don't know. I've had the pleasure of listening to your last two meetings or your last three meetings and the conversations that have gone on. This morning's conversation, absolutely fascinating. And to be quite candid, to even think about an impact on the marketability of title, given the conversation you just had, is absolutely, in my opinion, inappropriate. You have standards that are in place. And I should preface this, my comments, our comments have nothing to do whether the standards are right or wrong, good or bad. This is strictly related to your concepts of marketability of title or title defect. But as I've listened, and please correct me if I'm wrong, I've heard comments of people who know the standards exist, people who don't know the standards exist, people who are able and willing to get training, people who don't want to take the time for training or aren't concerned about getting trained in this area, don't have the capacity to get trained in this area, people who are knowledgeable about how to build correctly for the health and safety of the individuals in the home, others who may not have that knowledge. We don't have any level of review and enforcement mechanisms in place. So the concept of having a defect on title is absolutely a non-starter, because you don't have any of those pieces in place leading up to an end game for this discussion. The title defect is at the very end of a real estate transaction, or excuse me, the title search, if you will, similar to an appraisal, is at the very end of a real estate transaction, whether I'm buying a new home, whether it's an existing home with a buyer and seller in place. And if you don't have all of those pieces leading up to it, you're going to halt a real estate transaction for not having a certificate in place. And I guess I'll go back to the question, are we talking about meeting energy efficiency standards for the home? Or are you talking about just having a certificate filed in some land records? Which, if you're just having a certificate filed in the land records and you haven't achieved your goals of energy efficiency, why are we wasting our time here? I don't understand it. So for us, when I look at this discussion, when I hear this discussion for the banking industry, what we've presented for many, many years in the State House when issues come up regarding title is minimization of risk for the parties involved. As Liz said, you've got a 40-year look back. That property owner wants to know that if they buy that property, they've got clear title to it, that nobody's going to sweep in and claim that they had title ahead of time. The same is true for the financial services industry. We want to know that leading up to the closing, leading up to the real estate transaction, there is clear title to that property. We could set aside the whole discussion about what happens after the closing and the recording of documents so that nobody can slip in during that interim time frame. That's not for this committee. But as a lender, we want to know there's marketable title. We want to know there is clear title to that property, because in the event, if the borrower falls on hard times, if the borrower is unable to pay their bills, pay their mortgage, and we needed to foreclose as the last resort, we as the lenders want to know we've got marketable title, that we can go out and sell that property in the marketplace. Creating a title defect negatively impacts that. There's another aspect to this that folks need to understand, and Senator Bray, you know this from being on the Finance Committee, is financial institutions really hold mortgages in two ways. They'll either do it in portfolio, depending on the circumstances or of their customer that they're working with, or more traditionally, they will sell those mortgages in the secondary market to a Fannie Mae or a Freddie Mac. Those are buyers of the mortgage. That helps lenders to recapitalize their loan pool. So they can go out and make more mortgages and more mortgages by selling them to those secondary market players. They're not the only ones, but they're the biggest ones that we typically deal with. Any unique defect in title that Vermont creates halts that marketplace. They are incredibly risk averse. They are very much cookie cutter standards across the country that they apply to each state. And if you create something that is unique for Vermont, like we talked about many years ago, Senator Bray, in your committee with the dams, or we talked in the House many years ago with any piece of any property related discussion that title came up, we have this marketability of title language. It would not be impacted in statute for a reason, because we want to be able to have that marketplace continue. We want to be able to sell mortgages in the secondary market so that we can recapitalize loan programs to make more loans out there in the marketplace. So for us, a negative impact on title, a defect on title is very problematic as lenders. It's going to put a dampening effect on the real estate market and loans that are made in Vermont. And ultimately, it's at the end, as I said earlier, what you need to focus on, in my opinion, is the discussion you had today: awareness of the standards, education about the standards, incentives to get people to build correctly so that they're not putting property owners or residential users of those buildings in harm's way. Then at some point, get to the enforcement mechanisms. I'm sorry, I don't know the gentleman's name, but he's sitting at the very end of the table closest to the camera. As he said, going out and doing review for compliance to determine whether that was done. As my daughter is having to do with a real estate subdivision in my town. Once you get all of those pieces in place, then you could start talking about other mechanisms to achieve compliance. But marketability of title, quite honestly, is a non-starter for us, and we would ask you not to consider that in your recommendations to the legislature.
Great, thank you very much. Any questions for Chris? Kelly?
I don't know if this is something you can answer, Chris, but do you have alternative suggestions for how we might ensure that that certificate is there for the initial buyer of a home? Like I said earlier, we get the panic calls from people who are going to sell their home. The certificate's not there, now they can't get it. Is there any other avenue beyond a title defect that would ensure that certificate is present? And I will say, there's been comments about the certificate doesn't ensure it was actually compliant, and I get that, but in our compliance research, we also see compliant homes that don't have them either. It goes both ways. You have compliant homes that often the certificate's not there, and now you have a burden on the person who wants to sell that home in the future. So I don't know if this is something you can answer, but just curious.
Sure, I'll try a little bit, Kelly. You're asking for the title community or the lending community to be the cop on the beat to ensure that that document is in there. Otherwise, the transaction doesn't go through. That to me is an inappropriate place to have that discussion. The discussion is between the developer, the contractor, the seller of the property, and the buyer of the property. That is so far early on in the process, that seems to be the right place to do it. And so how do you create it? One, you got to start with an awareness. If I'm coming in to buy a piece of property, do I know as a buyer that that property has to comply with our BECSC standards? Probably not. I would say for the vast majority of people out there, they do not understand that that is in place. So there's an awareness or an education piece that has to be put out there. Then as a buyer, I can ask, where's the certificate? Because at some point, if I'm at the closing or the lawyer's doing the title search for the closing, where's the certificate? I don't know. I don't know. I didn't know I had to build to the standards, or the contractor's not there. That's why it's got to be dealt with early on in the process, when the home's being built, when the home's being retrofitted, or an addition's being put on. That early awareness with the sellers, buyers, and the contractors is where it needs to start. They're the ones that have the responsibility of ensuring that the work is done. Maybe they don't care if the work's not done, but that's where the certificate, the requirement for recording the certificate should be.
Just to clarify, I think Liz cited the statutory language. I mean, I know they may want that, but from a legal standpoint, there's no problem, right? And that's the answer to the person, like, if you, as a buyer, yeah, you may want to have that, but from a legal standpoint, if it's not in the record, not a problem, right? I thought that's what I heard Liz say.
Nobody hears it, so.
Right,
Doesn't affect title right now.
right. So if you have the alarmed property owner, I think the answer is, doesn't make any difference, you're fine. You may want it from the person you're buying it from, but legally, there's no issue there, so have a good day and relax.
Well, it's required to be filed with the department and in the land record, right?
Yeah,
But
I think a lot of
but-
lawyers
but-
advise their buyers
But
that
if
they
it's-
should have it.
But
right?
there's no penalty.
That's right. If
Right,
not,
right,
it's not, there's no
right.
penalty.
Yeah.
So we have this thing of laws that they're very aspirational. We love for people to do them, but then we give them escape clauses that say, but you really don't have to.
You still could be sued. So that's
For sure, but the statute in civil court, yes. But statutorily, nobody from the state, there's nobody coming down to say, your home is illegal. It has to be brought up to standard. So that, I mean, because I'm looking at this from a former zoning officer standpoint, to where somebody buys a property, there's a zoning violation that's found later, it has to be brought to code, and whoever owns the house at that point, or business or whatever, they're going to have a lot of expense. That's not what this is, and so that's what's kind of going through my head, you know. So as having been in that position before, having to tell somebody who bought a violation and gets to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to bring it to code, that's not what this is. So sleep tight, you're okay. Now there may be a civil case eventually with a contractor who's doing fraudulent works, doing certification, but that's not correct. But from the transaction perspective, you're good, because there's no enforcement authority that's going to come down on you, making you bring it up to code, that I could tell, unless I'm misunderstanding something that's entirely possible.
So, watching hands here. So, Matt Sharp first, and Walt, then Sandy, and I'm going to ask everyone to try to be brief, because we're going to we want to deal with. We won't have a full discussion on the rest of the items on our agenda. There's been a conversation that's been in depth, which is good. But if we can be brief now, we'll be able to. Certainly, this is not something we're settling now, but this is good conversation to have and get things to the table. So Matt Sharp, then Walt, then Sandy.
Yeah, thank you. Just a brief anecdote and then a question for Chris. When I was building my house in 2008, the only entity that asked me for Arby's compliance certificate was my bank. And then, so the question though is, from a banking industry perspective, do you have concerns or any checks and balances on the quality of the building that you're going to be investing in here?
Well, again, if you're looking at permitting compliance, code compliance, for example, I've got to do, my daughter's doing a subdivision in my town. She's had to go through the local process. She's had to demonstrate to the bank that's got her mortgage that they have gone through the subdivision process effectively, all permits in place, etc. I have no way as a lender, aside from what I see in the records, land records, permitting, et cetera, to determine whether your property has been built according to a particular code or not, unless there's some enforcement mechanism that shows that there's compliance. I would have no way of doing that as a lender. We do not have people who go out and investigate. We rely on appraisers. We would rely on lawyers for any determinations for meeting permit compliance.
But is that concerning? Is there any concern in from where you sit that doesn't exist?
In this particular case, yes, there's a concern that we have no enforcement mechanisms at all to determine it. Well, again, I guess it regarding whether we're just certifying that it's in the land records or whether the building's actually meeting codes. Is there a concern? Because as soon as we have a problem come up and the buyer or the seller's trying to sell their property, and now we find that the building is not in compliance, are we going to start ripping out walls? Are we going to rip down ceilings? Are we going to excavate to determine whether there's insulation around the foundation? And as soon as one problem happens in the marketplace, everybody else will start to react to that. So yes, there is a concern, but we also know that there's been, to some extent, a blind eye turned to this since the standards have been in place, with no enforcement.
Thank you.
Well,
Hopefully you can hear me. So let's assume for a moment that I'm getting ready to sell my house. I built it in 1974. So there is no certificate sitting in the land record, and therefore somebody could stand there and yell and scream and say, hey, there's no certificate, so you can't sell your house. So, okay, and I'm not going to resolve that issue. The next person who buys my house is not going to resolve that issue unless they put on an addition, and then they can certify that the addition meets the new standard. And more importantly, what happens if you built your house tomorrow to the 2020 standard and filed a certificate and everything is hunky-dory, and 8 years from now the lawyer says, well, there is a certificate, but it's for an awfully old code, and therefore we think you should bring that house up to standard before we let you buy it. So I think you're headed down a very slippery slope, and hope that somebody's going to be able to figure all this out, because quite frankly, there are millions, they're not millions, there are thousands of houses in Vermont that will never have a certificate unless somebody wants to invent one for an existing house or wants to force people to file a certificate after they have had their house winterized or weatherized to some standard. Thank you.
Sandy,
Super quick. I just want to suggest an alternate process that for RVs that could somewhat follow state building permits, especially after they get their database. So in that situation, if a builder is making a contract with a homeowner, they could simply fill out a very easy digital application of what they're going to be doing on the project. It should be super simple, but it would be already tagged in a database that the project's happening. And then when the project reaches substantial completion, the builder would simply reopen that and certify that they finished it according to their agreement. And that would be it. It would be at the whole state level. It would be, we could keep track of things. And then most importantly, if that went along with home builder certification, not just registered, but if they filed something wrong or failed to file or whatever, that would become part of their record at this point with OPR. So it's just a different, and I don't even know that it needs to involve the towns anymore. The key would be that it's in one place at the state and it's consistent across the state. and it doesn't bother town clerks who are already quite busy. Thank you.
Okay. Well, so thanks for a rich conversation. I have that uneasy feeling of seeing more and more problems clarified and put on the table, but problem definition is a critical phase of what we're trying to get to. Knowing that it's a complex problem, it's going to require multifaceted solution over a period of time. So, and that's probably, that's a good segue to what's next on our agenda. There's, we're at meeting 4, so we're coming around the far post. We have 6 meetings altogether, and then there's a editing meeting available after that. And but in terms of, I just wanted to look ahead, that our ultimate deliverables report. So how are we going to get there? In terms of committee discussion, it's clear, like today exemplifies it. It's not going to be easy to get to a single consensus point of view on everything. But I think have the report be lively and informative and accurate will, I think, in some areas the fight move be able to come to consensus, but not everywhere. And just wanted to let people know that trying to craft a report that will accommodate that. So that can be that there can be a minority report or comments along the way, and in terms of, so just wanted to preview where we'll end up going. And to help us get there, we're going to start to look at an outline of the report so we can start to see what we need to deliver on. The other thing is, in terms of keeping the report rich, people made a great series of pitches a few weeks ago, so those will go into as appendices. They may or may not be things that get implemented, but it will create a record that helps anyone reading and using the report to know that there's a lot of thinking and information out there available to any committee that would act on it. And as I've said way back in the very beginning, it was my intent to work with other legislators to help us advance on this through legislative action next session. What that bill does, I'm not being coy or discreet or anything. I don't know what we're laying out at this moment, but I know that we're on our way to figuring out some helpful things for taking that out. With that, I'd like to turn to Richard and just lay out, this is sort of in a way, besides this is 5 on our agenda, HJ options and tasks. It also, in a way, gives us an outline of previous things that we're going to be looking at in the report as well. So we're running a little short of time. And Richard, can you give us we have 3 things here. Can you give us a preview, and then we'll come back and start with this with adequate time at next meeting. But maybe you can just tee up next meeting.
So talk through the options under
5. Yeah.
Yeah. So as you indicated that, we've got a couple more meetings. There is an optional meeting in there too, if we need. But really, we've got meetings 5 and 6, and then potentially one more. But so we're going to need to start making some decisions on these items. And I guess the question in my mind is, so these items that are listed in the agenda. I don't know if you want to bring it up. Everybody may have it, but these we pulled from the pitches that were presented at the last meeting. So sort of categorically, we need to talk about roles and responsibilities, both for code administration and for the code update process. That may be one entity. It may be split into 2. There were some different suggestions there, but sort of roles and responsibilities. And then there are a number of sort of tasks as well too, including we touched on some of these today. So plan reviews, a variance process, appeals process, conflict resolutions with other codes, inspection, certification, enforcement, permits, database, and then how do we pay for all of this? So it feels like we've got a lot to tackle here. And I don't think we can go into detail on all of these, but we do need to address, our primary charge here, which is consider and recommend strategies to increase awareness of and compliance with RBs and CBs, including the potential designation of DFS in the Department of Public Safety as the statewide authority having jurisdiction for administration, interpretation, and enforcement in conjunction with DFS's existing jurisdiction over building codes. That's sort of our first charge. And is there a way for us to address that particular charge of this committee sort of at a high level without going into the details of all of these elements? We're going to need to address them, but the one thing I did want to state too is that we do have this DOE codes grant, and the primary deliverable of that is to come up with a statewide plan for what comes out of this committee. So to some extent, I think sort of outlined this originally. We were thinking, can we set a sort of broad structure framework for where we might be going, and then part of that effort is to have a steering committee, which could logically be this committee here, to sort of follow through with the details. But if we're going to finish our work here in 2 or 3 meetings, is there a way for us to come up with that sort of high level structure, addressing at least the question that we have about the role that this might have in DFS as a starting point, with the acknowledgement that that's not going to be the end of the conversation. There may be an opportunity to put the pieces in place over the next year. So I don't know. I don't have an answer to this, but I think it would be useful for us to think about how we get our work done in this context.
One thing I've thought about from a practical point of view and takes the pressure off a little is to think about the whole report and the project as a timeline as well. So it's not like we need every answer fully developed at this point. There could be certain things we know. If it's like it will be phased in. So it'll be a work in progress for a period of time. So I wonder to what degree we can identify what we need to be more specific on at this point, and then say these are other pending questions with a variety of design answers being proposed by the group, but we don't have to nail it down. And I'm not trying to evade something. I just don't want to overwhelm our ability to make enough decisions that might be playing out over the next 7 years or something. Forecast that precisely.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I sent out an email over the weekend that I wanted to bring up because I think it may help us a little bit when we go back to the intention of what we're trying to accomplish here. And that's dealing with residential building energy standards, primarily, of course, CBs as well. And I say this with all due respect because I think they're not terrible ideas. I had a conversation with Sandy about it the other day. From my perspective and the conversations and the language and reading the reports that I've read, a lot of folks seem to want to position us to move over to the full IRC. And that is where DFS comes in, and that's where this big, larger moving element happens. And that's like a multi-year project. That's not what we're doing today. That's going to require a much larger group of stakeholders than 2 trade associations. There's thousands of more builders in the state than we represent. So if we focus our efforts on the building energy standards and we don't try to create a framework to move something else into, using the things that we have, whether it's DPS, DFS, we work with what we have to try to move that ball forward and not create another university over here, we'll be a lot more successful.
I was thinking the exact same, similar on what I think. That's a huge, I don't know if we're ready to answer that question yet, But that, to me, the pathway is completely different if we try to develop a formalized, you know, building compliance world that we simply don't have, that other states have.
Chris, anything?
And on the DFS question, I was trying to think of any jurisdiction where I've worked or lived where fire safety also did building code inspection. In my experience, those are always separate because they have a whole other world to deal with.
Right.
And so saying, we want you to do your fire safety work, and while you're at it, can you do building or, you know, building energy standard work? I mean, I don't know if anybody in testimony or anything else has done research into to what extent where that's combined and what the logic was behind combining those things. It feels like we're shoehorning in a responsibility where maybe it's not necessarily a good fit. I'm not questioning what, you know, fire and safety's capability, but, you know, they're not just looking at construction, right? They're looking at alarms and sprinkler systems and everything else that has nothing, you know, it's not just those building inspections. So that's just a question I would put out there, and it might, depending on the answer to it, it might make this a conversation a lot more efficient.
I would just add on this briefly. I understand that there's been some great things that have been tossed out here today relevant to training and so forth and all this, and this is definitely not going away. A few things, we are not necessarily what you typically find across the country as building officials. We have our hands in everything, to expertise in fire alarms, sprinklers, generator, you name it, right across the board. We're big on the life safety code. We adopt the IBC, the building code and so forth, but we rely heavily on third-party folks like architects, structural engineers, mechanical engineers, and so forth to compile the construction drawings for plan review. So we don't have to go out and do these sophisticated, what some states do as building officials, like you would find in Los Angeles or maybe downtown New York City on high-rise buildings. The whole landscape is much different here. Majority of our buildings are pre-engineered buildings. They're not skyscrapers. So we have brought what I term, being here 34 years, common sense approach to the building industry here in Vermont, where we can be mindful of the economic impact while making the building safe. We have brought the state of Vermont down from being in the top 10 for fire fatalities down to one of the safest states in the country now. So I just want to raise this issue that we have literally zero bandwidth left in us right now. I never want to put my name on something that I can't put 110% into and come out shining, right? It's a disservice to people. It's not my sales pitch here. I just want people to realize zero bandwidth. You get into the energy codes, and there are some statements today about going way beyond what the basic code requirements are. That is bogging down the system. We promulgate rules for many different areas. And the more you modify those codes, then the more problems you get into. You've got to look at the training. You've got to look at the education. And it's not just for contractors, it's the people that regulate it. And it's a real challenge for us. We find it difficult to train our own people. It took me over a year to hire 4 fire marshals, good pay, over a year. And I still haven't been able to start the rental housing safety code enforcement program. We're not going to get new positions. I'm just telling you, whether growing government is just not favorable. And you look at all the flood damage that's been done, all the money that might have been out there, in my opinion, is going to get diverted to repairs. I'm just telling you, they're trying to find money to help Vermonters out right now. I see this as a very challenging time to push this. And I'm not saying what you're all doing is it's a noble cause and it's gonna happen. And I agree with what everyone here is saying about the phase-in approach, and you can do all that stuff too, but I want to be at the table. I'm glad I'm at the table. And wherever this falls, it'll go through the legislative process and I think at the end of the day, we can come up with something that'll work. I do. I think that, it may take a couple years to gradually phase stuff in, but the educating people, we've been dealing with the same contractors for 34 years. And now they're as old as I am. And most people want to do the right thing. It's been stated here. It's not a willful negligence of duty here by contractors. They just don't know. There is an awareness component here. We can be part of that process. That's it.
And on to what Chris said.
Sure, but Sandy, you've been waiting.
Yeah. I was just going to say that Vermont has to be a common sense state. We don't have a lot of industry or commerce. And 50 years ago, they entrusted the oversight of public buildings to fire safety. And you have since then done a great job, a really great job of what you have. And even beyond what you have, you've done a good job. After talking to Matt, I agree, especially this year after the floods, this is a difficult year to ask people for something more of. All we're asking for is a standard of care for residential buildings, which we haven't had before. However, what I think is appropriate to ask as a very minimum is that this group not steer the Titanic away from having a simple, consistent system for the building trades and for all buildings, including residences in the future. Right now, we have 3 organizations that are involved. We are talking about OPR a lot, public services, a big part of this, and fire safety for the commercial buildings at least. And just the coordination between those 3 entities has resulted in a lot of the gaps of oversight that we're dealing with now. So that's why I will keep proposing that we come up with at least the framework. That's what I think the architects and builders are asking for, is a framework that maybe we don't fill it in right now. We could phase that later, but not to do something now that will make it harder to accomplish those goals later.
Well, hopefully we'll book passage on a ship other than the Titanic.
Yes. Let's come up with it.
Yeah, I just want to add really quickly to Chris and Michael's points that when I talk to people in other states and read compliance reports, other states with code official networks are also struggling with energy code compliance for exactly what Chris said. That their code officials focus on the highest priority, like DFS does, and that's health and safety. So it's not, I don't want it out there as the panacea of like, do this and I'll be fixed. I think they focus on the residential construction code and all the safety issues and still energy standards, even when they have that infrastructure can get sidetracked. So I just want to point that out, that it's not an automatic, like have code officials, it's all solved.
Well, again, thank you everyone for contributing. And so next meeting, I want to talk about that briefly. Richard, can we do you want to say something very briefly about the cost effectiveness subgroup and just let people know what it isn't doing, and then we'll spend more time on it next meeting.
Yeah, I mean, it's really a work in progress. We had a 1-hour meeting. We reviewed the process that we go through now. We began the discussion about whether there are some complementary, potentially alternative ways of addressing cost effectiveness. And we have a meeting scheduled for Friday, I believe, in that conversation with the goal of coming back to this committee with some recommendations.
Okay. So look forward, and maybe we'll have some time to report on it next week. A little bit. I suppose what happens at the meeting. So just reminding people we're going to meet in a week, and we don't usually have them back to back, but time we do. And we'll be hearing it. So where Sandy was referring to OPR, we haven't had them in, and they'll be in next week. We're also going to be talking to Jamie Fien, that we hope impacts on property insurance. Another piece of the puzzle that's come up. We'll start to have an outline of the report. And I'm hoping to work with Richard on the notion of a timeline that would let us look at phasing, like of all these things, which need to go in what sequence, so that we focus in more detail on the things that are clear to us. Are there, and the other thing is we always have public comment. I know we've had a few members of the public who have chipped in along the way, which makes, when we can, it makes more sense, because then we're all talking about the same topic at the same time. Any member of the public who wanted to speak to the group before we adjourn today? Okay, so I'm not hearing not seeing any hands or hearing any voices. Thanks so much. We're going to finish it exactly on time. Thank you, everyone, for a really good meeting. Looking forward to the next one. And again, though it's not probably your regular habit, I kept reviewing the minutes, because there's a lot in these minutes from each meeting. And with that, see you back here in a week, September 12th at 9:30. And we are adjourned.